All right. Thank you, David. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here, my first trip to Camden, Maine. But I'm here to talk about a very sad case because Venezuela truly is a tragic case. The failure of democracy in this country is really one of the saddest stories of the Western Hemisphere. What I'd like to do is talk about, similar to what Ambassador Shattuck just talked about, the lessons that we can learn from this case. And you'll see a lot of similarities with Hungary and some differences. So I will do that by talking about three periods in Venezuela's history. One is its 40-year democracy, starting in 1958 to 1998, where basically they had something very similar to the United States, essentially alternating between two parties, a center-right and a center-left party, sort of like the Democrats and the Republicans. But that ended in 1998 when Hugo Chavez was elected. I was there with the Carter Center monitoring that election, which was a competitive, fair election in 1998. And he initiated the second period, the Bolivarian Revolution, as he called it, during the rest of his own lifetime from 1999 to 2012, when he died of cancer. In early 2013, he died. And that initiated the third period with his successor, Nicolás Maduro. And so now we call it Madurismo instead of Chavismo, the previous period. And a real turn to complete autocracy or authoritarianism now, which continues today. So the puzzle is, how did this oil-rich, founding member of OPEC, democratic country end up with a failed state and economy, mass immigration, and an authoritarian government? Well, first I think we need to look at what was the opening for a populist polarizer to come into power in 1999. And we saw, similar to what we've heard earlier today, some frustration in Venezuela after 40 years of the same two parties basically running the country, and perceptions among the electorate that these parties had become unresponsive, mismanaging the economy, and even corrupt. And because Venezuela is an oil country, it goes through the booms and busts of oil prices. And during the heyday of high oil prices in the 1970s, poverty was only 25%. When oil prices declined by the 1990s, poverty rose to 65%. So people thought democracy had stopped delivering. Does that sound familiar? And Venezuelans turned to an outsider, complete outsider. In fact, in those elections in 1998, none of the candidates claimed to be from one of those traditional political parties, because that would doom them in the polls. So those were the elections. This is a picture I took of some of the slums crawling up the mountainsides of Caracas. So enter in Hugo Chavez, whom I call the master polarizer. Now, he's a little bloated in this picture because this is near the end. 2012, his last election was when he had been receiving a lot of cancer treatment, and this is the effect. But Hugo Chavez had been a military leader who led a coup, a military coup against the elected government back in 1992. The coup failed. He was put in prison for a while, but pardoned by the next president. And so when he came out, he decided to follow the electoral route to power instead of the military coup route. And he was elected with a large majority. He truly had a mandate, I would say, in 1999. And he began what he called his Bolivarian Revolution. Now, the debate at that time was, within Venezuela and among us, kind of analysts and academics observing it, was Chavez the destroyer or the savior of Venezuelan democracy? Remember, there was this frustration with what was happening. There was hyperinflation in the 1990s, bank failures, unstable politics. When he came in, he promised in his campaign a radical restructuring of democracy to address what he said and what people saw were deficits of rising income inequality, corruption, and elitism. But as he did so and began his radical restructuring, he did so by following the pattern, and actually I'm going to say he actually helped create the pattern of polarizing populists who use democratic methods to undermine the democracy itself in the name of the people. So Hugo Chavez really developed the democratic backsliding playbook of the 21st century. Going back before Orban, I'm going to say we start here in 1999. And you'll see some of the same patterns we just heard from Ambassador Shattuck in Hungary. So before winning power, and let me say, I'm calling this a democratic backsliding playbook. You would have heard of the authoritarian playbook that's been talked about a lot today, but it begins with democratic backsliding because we're talking about governments, presidents, leaders, parties who come to power with the vote of the people. They're not coming to power through a military coup or some other, revolution or something else. So during the campaign, before winning power, a democratic backslider will use a polarizing discourse really focused on us versus them to divide citizens. And as they do, they identify scapegoats and enemies to blame for whatever the grievances of the people are. If people are anxious because they've lost their jobs, or they're suffering from high food prices, or they're worried about immigrants and crime, they focus on that and they play up and exploit these possible grievances and really help people feel like they understand things by identifying an easy answer, somebody to blame for the problems. They create distrust in the media and in expertise, as we've also talked about today, and they discredit their opposition. Now, if they win, and this can be a very winning electoral strategy, once they get into power then, they continue that polarizing discourse. They usually then move to change election laws to give their own party an advantage and stay in power. They will purge bureaucracies, courts, even the military and security forces, and put in loyalists. They will muzzle independent media, and they will restrict dissent and criticism. So what we learned from looking at Venezuela, this early pattern, is first that I would say Chavez initiated the wave of 21st century populism, nationalist populism in Latin America. It spread in Latin America, particularly among leftists. As David said, we're contrasting a leftist and a rightist kind of version of this, but then moved to Europe and the United States and what we've seen today and what Ambassador Shattuck described. The polarization dynamics that we observed in Venezuela, and I was watching this country really eat itself to death and tear itself apart with this polarization dynamics. These are harmful to democracy. So I call this pernicious polarization, this particular type of polarization and strategy of using this demonization, this blaming, this dividing us versus them logic. And then third, we learned that elected governments can, in fact, undermine democracy by using this incremental democratic backsliding method. And it can slide down to autocracy. Now, we hear a lot about these leaders who are doing this, but they can't do it alone. The opposition matters, and it matters what strategy they choose as well, or whether they just, fold up and go home. So I made kind of two chain reactions that we can see how the polarization part works and how the populism part works. So the polarizing strategies come in, so a leader comes in using this polarizing strategy, exploiting whatever grievances exist, and creating this tribal logic of us versus them, which really creates the mutual distrust, the dislike, that affective polarization that we heard this morning from Josh. And that can lead people to suspect the other side. They bond with their side, and they exaggerate the goodness of their side, and they begin to distrust the other side, and they exaggerate stereotypes, prejudices of the other side, and they begin to believe that, in fact, the other side would be an existential threat to their way of life, to the nation. And that can lead them to support leaders who will violate democratic norms and principles. Now, the populist part of it, because not all polarizers are populists, but populism is generally polarizing because it's dividing. It's trying to say there's a divide between the people, who are usually considered to be good and virtuous, and the nefarious elites who are exploiting them. A populist will come in then with this philosophy claiming to represent the people, and in that sense be a unique representative of the people. They will use the majority vote. They'll come to power democratically, usually winning a majority, or the plurality if it's not quite a majority, as in our last election in the US. And they will say, we have a mandate because the majority won. And they will delegitimize any possibility of electoral loss because they're the unique representative of the people. The people are the majority against the elites. So if they lose, it must have been an unfair election. Once they come to power, then they will ignore checks and balances because they represent the people. They talk directly to the people, whether through the radio, as Chavez started doing, or now through social media, and they ignore any other constraints from legislatures and courts. And they usually practice illiberalism, meaning when political scientists talk about liberal democracy, as we claim the United States is, it's not only the majority vote side, which is the majority, the people ruling, as we heard this morning from David, but it's also the protection of minority rights, individual civil liberties, and checks and balances. And so, just as Viktor Orban claims to have an illiberal democracy, this is what often happens. All right, so what did Chavez do during his revolution? Well, oil prices were quite low when he came in, so he was constrained at the beginning. But they rose in his first several years, and he was able, do you remember in the early 2000s, oil prices actually went up to $150 a barrel. They got very expensive. For Venezuela, it was a big boom. He was able to redistribute this to the poor and really decreased poverty and inequality and helped them out a lot. In so doing, he concentrated power in his own hands, but he kept winning elections. And he won with large majorities, 56, 58, 60%. Until he died. Right before he died, he sort of endorsed one of the people in his entourage. He was the foreign minister at the time, Nicolas Maduro. Nicolas Maduro had been a union leader of bus drivers, was his past. He ran in the election in 2013 and won very narrowly, 1.5% difference. Also very similar to the election we just had here. But there, the opposition claimed there were irregularities and even fraud, but they couldn't prove it. They didn't have any evidence to prove it. But they did try to protest, but Maduro stayed in. And he's still there today. So what's happened under him? He has so Chavez hurt democracy tremendously, but Maduro has destroyed democracy. So in his 12 years in power to date, he has established an authoritarian government that relies on extreme repression. And we can talk about that much more so than Hungary. There is massive corruption and organized crime. The human rights abuses are prolific. There are currently 1,600 political prisoners now estimated by an NGO in Venezuela, and that's after the release of a couple of hundred of them. The economy had been failing. Now, Maduro had the bad luck of those high prices that Chavez benefited from for oil. They started falling in 2014. That's bad luck for Maduro. But in addition to falling oil prices, his own policies and mismanagement really hurt the economy. And the GDP shrunk by 75% from 2014 to 2021. Now, in there, the US also put on sanctions. In 2018, 2019, really tightened the sanctions, even on their oil sales and the financial and oil sanctions. So that also contributed to it. But primarily, I would put the blame on the Maduro government, as well as lower oil prices. It got so bad that in 2018, inflation reached, this is not a typo, 130,000%. Not surprisingly, this created a huge humanitarian crisis. People, there were no supplies in the hospitals. People had to bring their own sheets, their own blood, their own needles. People were eating out of the trash. I mean, it was really horrible for a country that had really grown to have a fairly large middle class at one point. And so many people left in the largest refugee flow, immigration flow we've seen in this Western Hemisphere. 1/4 of the population has now left since 2014. That's 7.7 million people, about 700,000 of which are in the United States. Colombia, next door to Venezuela, houses really close to 3 million, much more than the United States, which of course is much larger. Now, I had mentioned that opposition strategies matter as well, and they do. When Chavez was first elected, and he was confrontational, he kind of elicited a backlash, a counter-populism backlash and mobilization. And they tried many ways to remove him from power, including an attempted coup that only lasted 2 days, and then the military changed course and put him back in power. It was right after that, in fact, that he invited former President Jimmy Carter to mediate between himself and his political opposition, and I was the principal advisor to Jimmy Carter during this time. So the opposition had maximalist demands. They weren't trying to negotiate a change in policies or a share of power or, respect the legislature and the other institutions. They wanted him out. But everything they tried, not only the coup, but an oil strike and sit-ins and massive protests, nothing worked. He stayed in, even during a recall referendum, which he won. So by 2004, 2005, he really had taken control. He was able to take control of the courts, the media, many institutions. And the opposition in the next period then became much fragmented, demoralized, internal rivalries, hard to bring together. They couldn't present a clear vision of what their alternative would be. And so they, basically couldn't dislodge either Chavez or Maduro from the presidency. They did win some elections. Every time they united, they won some elections at lower levels in the legislature, in the governorships and municipalities. Until last year. July of last year, they had a spectacular victory. They united, and they organized not only people to come out to vote, because by this time Maduro is very unpopular, but to protect the vote. And they had people there in every polling place to watch the vote count and get a copy of the tally sheet of the vote count, so they could defend the election. And they had a positive message, and they won, according to their vote tallies, by 67% for the opposition candidate versus Maduro's. Now, Maduro's electoral council, handpicked, did not recognize this and claimed that Maduro won with 51%. Produced no evidence, did not produce the breakdown they always had before of the vote at every polling place. They just claimed, no, he won by 51%, that's the total. So the election victory was stolen. Now these are the people. The man in the middle is Edmundo Gonzalez. He was the stand-in opposition presidential candidate because the actual opposition leader who'd won a primary the year before is this woman, Maria Corina Machado. I knew her back in the early days. She led an NGO back in that early 2000s. She has proven herself to be a phenomenal organizer and strategist, and worked very hard to organize this and unite the opposition and the people to have this electoral victory. She is now, but she was prohibited from running by the Maduro government. That's why they had this stand-in, Edmundo Gonzalez, who was a retired diplomat. The picture on the right is her talking to a crowd, a protest after the election was basically denied by the Maduro government. She is in hiding in Venezuela. He left, went into exile abroad, and is traveling around the world trying to rally support. She's in hiding. She could, she is in great danger, but she still comes out once in a while to rallies and tries and gives messages to try to maintain the morale of the opposition, which of course is getting more and more difficult. So what happened? The international reactions to that election on the opposition side was the United States, Latin America, European Union, but Maduro has some pretty important supporters: China, Russia, Cuba, Iran, Turkey, and even India buying its oil. So what are the prospects for change today? Everyone wants to know, how will it change? How can it happen? It looks like Maduro holds all the cards. He still has the security forces, the intelligence, he has all the institutions, all the media, but it's a fragile hold. His own people are united around him based on fear, not on loyalty to the cause or to him. They fear that if they lose power, they will go to jail and be punished. They are, many of them, under indictment in the United States for corruption, drug running, and human rights abuses. Also, the country is being investigated by the International Criminal Court. And then, of course, if the opposition were to take power, they fear that they would be jailed and retribution within the country, unless there's a negotiation over some form of conditional or limited amnesty. Maduro's popular support would be a maximum of 20% if there were truly a free and fair election, which there's not. But the wild card now is the United States. President Trump had in his first presidency put on these strict sanctions. President Biden lifted them in 2024, trying to encourage, lifted some, not all, some, by allowing Chevron to go in and have its license to produce oil again. It had been there. Mainly also for Chevron to be able to be paid back for the debt that Venezuela had incurred with it. But Biden was trying to encourage Maduro to hold free and fair elections. That didn't work. And so now we have, President Trump has to decide, will that partial lifting of sanctions continue, because Venezuela's oil production is going up a bit because of these individual licenses to a couple of companies to go in. In fact, the US, some of that oil comes to the US, is purchased in the US today. Or will he put back on sanctions, return to his maximum pressure strategy he had in his first time? Well, so far it looks like, Donald Trump's main issue at the moment is deporting immigrants. And his special envoy did travel to Venezuela, met with Maduro, got a deal for Maduro to begin again accepting deported immigrants, which he was not accepting. And so some of them are now starting to be flown back. Remember those 700,000 here in the US? Maduro, of course, wants all the sanctions lifted. That hasn't happened yet, but neither have the hardest sanctions been put back. So this is where we are. We don't know exactly where US policy will go on this. But my prediction is that Maduro's hold is so fragile that an authoritarian government cannot sustain itself with only repression. It has to have some kind of legitimacy of delivery of some goods to people or to its key factions to sustain itself. So it's not sustainable but we don't know when or how it will fall. It will fall, but we can't predict when. Thank you.